Hello, everyone. My name is Mark Kenny. I'm a journalist and these days an academic at ANU in Canberra. I'm also host of the Democracy Sausage podcast, which you may have heard of. I'm delighted to be guest presenting this webinar hosted by the Australia Institute with one of our great public intellectuals, Professor of Constitutional Law at UNSW, Megan Davis. Professor Davis is the author of the latest quarterly essay, Voice of Reason, on Recognition and Renewal. And before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that I live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country here in Canberra, land that was never ceded. As long-time listeners and viewers would know, the times for these webinars does vary from time to time, so check out the website, australiainstitute.org.au. We're broadcasting on Zoom today. There is a Q&A function, and we're happy to field your questions and comments, time permitting. Keep things civil if you don't mind, and on topic in the chat, or you will be booted out. This discussion is being recorded and will go up on the Australia Institute website and the YouTube channel. It is part of Australia's biggest book club. Thank you for your interest. Hopefully you have bought a copy of the quarterly essay from your newsagent or bookstore today, or perhaps more, in the recent days, and you intend to buy other copies for family and friends. Do it. It's a good idea. I'm delighted to cross to Professor Megan Davis today. She's a cobble woman of the Burrungum Nation and a renowned constitutional lawyer and public law expert, focusing on advocacy for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Her work extends internationally as well through roles at the United Nations, focusing on global Indigenous rights. She was the lead lawyer in the design of the regional dialogues held across the country, culminating in a national constitutional convention at Uluru in 2017. The purpose of those 12 dialogues and one regional meeting was to consult and educate, resulting in the most proportionally significant consultation process of First Nations peoples Australia has ever seen. She was the first person to read out the Uluru Statement from the Heart in May 2017, something she has just repeated in May 6 years later. Great to be talking to you, Megan Davis. I'm sorry, can't hear you.
Thank you. Sorry, I always have trouble unmuting for some reason.
It's great to be talking to you on this occasion. There's so much to talk about. Congratulations on this essay. It's a really excellent piece of work, and I think really useful contribution to this debate that this country is having. Hopefully many people will read it. I know many more people won't read it. It's hard to get people to engage with the detail of things, and I guess that goes to the heart of the challenge that the country faces. Now, I asked members of the audience to keep things civil, and I'm sure Australia Institute people will, but more broadly, as a nation, how do you think we're doing on that civility scale? There seems to me to be a fair bit of rudeness around and a fair bit of reckless exaggeration.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the work that I do out of UNSW with the Uluru leadership and the Uluru dialogue, we're out in the regions talking to Australians face to face, for example, in an FNQ, and we get all sorts come in, no voters and One Nation voters. And I think that discourse has been civil, at least from what we've experienced. But yeah, I think that the four no campaigns who belong under the same kind of no umbrella are prosecuting some pretty distasteful things. And I think we have a real problem with disinformation and misinformation. What experts and pollsters are telling me is they expected that avalanche to come in 2022 with Albo's federal election, but it hasn't, and it's arrived in a kind of voluminous kind of sense for this referendum. And I think people are just grappling now with how to manage it. How do you address it and push back on it? How do you run future federal elections if they're going to be based on the kinds of falsehoods and fabrications and ridiculous scenarios and hyperbole that you're seeing? How do Australians make informed decisions if what they're being given is not accurate information? And so So there's that element to the campaign, as well as, you know, other matters relating to racism. I know most Aboriginal people on Twitter and social media have just seen this rapid escalation in really, really racist trolls and Twitter accounts and all sorts of things. I just block anyone who's racist. And so right now, I mean, I must have blocked thousands and thousands because I don't get as much anymore. But it's out there, and I know some people are really struggling to manage that and how to navigate that. It brings up memories of their childhood or school, the classroom or the schoolyard, and so there is that added level of stress for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities.
Yeah, can I ask you about that? Just on that question of stress for a moment. Aboriginal leaders have stepped forward from the Uluru Statement in 2017, and now this campaign has reached this kind of official stage. We have a government that's committed to it, and the referendum date is shortly to be set. I wonder if you wouldn't mind just addressing what it's like as one of the community leaders, being out there in the public, essentially being exposed, as it were, having made what is, I think anyone who's read the Uluru Statement knows, is a very graceful and generous pathway forward for this nation, which will unlock, I think, future processes as well. Indeed, that's what it's intended to do. But what is it like just sort of hanging out there, as it were, for the judgment of people? And some of that judgment, as you've just been saying, is pretty hostile, unfortunately. Yeah,
I mean, for me, I was always a public lawyer. To some extent, people accept that this is a particular path I'm on. I think it's harder for other people who've come into the space in a more recent time, as they get accused of bad faith because they haven't worked in the space. I mean, I think I was probably naive to think that there's a kind of linear approach to a referendum, and didn't expect some of the allegations and misinformation made about the Uluru Statement and the process, which we worked on really, really hard to ensure that it was a robust sample of our people, and just wasn't prepared for the numbers of people of bad faith in the space. That is to say, deliberately misconstruing and misinterpreting both the work of the Uluru Statement, but things that you say. I do take my hat off to politicians, because it's not nice to be public and exposed in a way that people, and to also, I've seen it happen to people like Lee Sales, just really intense judgments made about you. I haven't had it in the intensity she did, but Twitter, for example, is problematic, because it's just reduced that, the public can talk to editors and journos and anyone they want, really, and you've got to make a decision whether or not you're going to engage with that. But that can be quite full on.
Yeah, I know. I witness this myself every time I write something about The Voice or comment on it. The response, it just goes on for days and days. And I suppose it's hard to know the extent to which, and it's different for me because I don't, have the, it's not like I'm one of the Aboriginal community leaders in this situation, but it's hard to know the extent to which it's representative of community attitudes or part of an orchestrated campaign. Most of these people seem to be very angry, and they seem to be people who've joined the platform quite recently, have relatively few followers. Yeah. I've seen studies that say that they're not bots, they're actually people who are being orchestrated on Telegram and other platforms to then sort of mob voice advocates.
I think that's exactly, I can see that happening a lot. In the early days when Alworth was first elected and I was appointed to the referendum working group, people would take shots of me in particular. There was one photo that was taken by the press gallery, and it's of the entire desk. It's one of those huge rooms in Parliament House. And someone kind of scrolled in, or whatever it's called, amplified what I was wearing. I was wearing a cape, and they put it into Google Images and was like, he's an elite with a, however ridiculous price, $10,000 cape. This is what the elites do. And I think that stuff's interesting because we have this kind of, on the one hand, this narrative that it's really important for Aboriginal people to have an education, and that education is the key to social mobility. And most people, universities and corporations, put their money into the education at side of things, scholarships, etc., and are always boasting of the success of those scholarship holders. And then once you get the education, and once you're in that space and you're contributing to that, using your expertise, if they don't like it, they turn around and call you an elite, and disregard all of that work. I mean, it's easy to do, right? Because it's easy to be no. You just get to throw things around like academic and expert and elite and bureaucrat and Canberra-based and all that kind of stuff, which is code for not an ordinary Australian. But there is a lot of tensions that play out in the Aboriginal space in relation to that. I see Warren Mundine talk often about the scholarships that he supports, but on the other hand, label all of the people who do have educations and are contributing as elites.
Yeah, there's a lot of contradictions there. Just on the sort of point you made before about using the word racism and the sort of racism tag that is thrown around in this debate. I remember quite early on after the election writing that, advocates of the voice need to be careful not to brand people who are no voters as racist automatically. The campaign has to be about swaying people, persuading people, bringing them on board, not simply pushing them into a camp. What surprised me, though, and it just never even entered my mind, but it's nonetheless become sort of endemic, is the extent to which the no case has branded the yes case racist, which is some sort of Trumpian inversion, it seems to me. But this is really sort of, again, with the limitation of how good this sample size is, how representative it is. But this has really taken hold amongst a number of no campaigners who throw around words they have no idea about, like apartheid, have no appreciation for what apartheid actually was and is. And as I say, racism and so forth. I wonder how frustrating that is for you. And I suppose, going to your original point, the extent to which you're able to dissuade people of those things in those face-to-face conversations that you were talking about.
Yeah, 100%. I'm glad you raised this, because it's been one of my pet peeves about how it's rolled out. So not kind of a little bit before Alba and a little bit after, some columnists started saying, well, I can't say this because I'm being branded a racist. And, I've followed this forensically for 6 years. I know that there was nothing written where people were branding these columnists racist. In fact, most Australians wouldn't even know that they were going to comment on The Voice, and it has become a kind of pet topic for some. But that's absolutely been generated from day one, and we can track that, because you can't, when you see them write the columns, there's actually nobody calling them racist. But it's an effective Trumpian tool that they've used from day one, where they've enlisted it and created now a narrative where everybody's saying, well, I can't say anything because I'm going to be regarded as racist, and it's simply not true. I mean, the reality of the conversation is that over the past 6 years, the polling was pretty robust, because I think the bulk of Australians do support it. But also, when you go out and have these conversations with Australians, a lot of them, went to school with blackfellas, or in regional Australia, like, they're really cognizant of Aboriginal issues, of course. And our focus group showed that last week that we just did, that shows that, regional Australians are quite, literate about the problems facing Aboriginal Australia. That's not the problem. And so you can have those conversations with Australians, and they're not held in the same way that they might have been 20 years ago in the Howard era. Australia today is not John Howard's Australia. In fact, British-born, non-Indigenous Australians, it's very much a brown country now, is what the census stats tell us, what our polling tells us. And so the conversations are really different. They're not about racism. They're conversations about democracy, And, will this improve the situation for Aboriginal people? There seems to be a really strong desire for Australians to know that this will make a difference on the ground. But the race stuff isn't prominent, but it is for the no case. And I find the apartheid stuff objectionable, and certainly there are South Africans who've written about how repugnant that argument is. But also, I think Warren Mundine the other day implied that the voice will be like the protection era, that it's the return of the mission and reserve era, which is actually really was very kind of, I think a lot of Aboriginal people were hurt by that suggestion. But also it's ridiculous. It's not the protection era. It's not by any stretch of the imagination. And so, yeah, there's a lot of ridiculous allegations and suggestions being made, and not really being pushed back on either, I would have to say.
Yes, I would agree with that. I mean, that's kind of, I suppose that's a broader frustration that one might have about this whole period, is the extent to which it feels a bit asymmetric. The no case has sort of gone out all guns blazing, and putting forward, a sort of a scattergun approach of whatever argument might resonate with whatever person, however ridiculous. And we've seen some descent into the absolutely absurd in the last 24 hours with claims that the voice is the reason, or the government's commitment to it is the reason that interest rates are as high as they are, backed by made by the opposition leader and backed by the deputy opposition leader, David Littleproud, today as well. Just extraordinary. And it sort of brings me, I suppose, I wasn't going to go to this straight away, but it brings me to the sort of, I guess, the challenge. You would know as a constitutional lawyer better than anyone the history of referendums and the requirement for bipartisanship. This one does not enjoy that. It's therefore kind of already fallen into some extent to the kind of political matrix, the taxonomy of the parties taking different positions. How hard does that make it to drive it forward? And to what extent is that absence of really clear leadership in the political sphere I'm talking about here, really, to what extent does that present an additional challenge?
So, I mean, 8 out of 44 referendums have succeeded, and a number of those referendums were all at the same ballot box. So it's quite a smaller kind of number in terms of the physical act of voting. But, experts and pollsters and all of those people that kind of study referendums and study Australian democracy, but particularly experts in Australian electoral law, say that the record, the 8 out of 44, is just not something that's applicable to 2023. And that's because social media exists now, and it's never existed. None of the other referendums had to grapple with that. So you always knew that disinformation, misinformation was going to be a problem. The other issue is that trust in Australian political institutions and politicians is at an all-time low now, whereas 67, for example, it was an all-time high. And there's just been a complete reversal of attitudes in relation to that, to today. So, back in the last successful referendum about 40 years ago, you had 3 editions of the Courier Mail being sold out the front of a central station, and you'd get the midday edition or the afternoon edition. That doesn't happen now. So Australians got a lot of its information about referendums from the newspaper, and very much what was run in the newspaper, was between journalists who were taken seriously, not that now, but and the political politics. And that's how people receive the bulk of their information and analysis in relation to these things. And so bipartisanship perhaps doesn't mean what it meant back then. I don't know. What I know is about the majority of referendums that have failed has been because of the expansion of federal power. So people say, well, it's Labor, Labor's got a bad record, but actually Australians don't like the expansion of federal power. They clearly don't. They vote no to it every single time. And that's the bulk of the no's. This isn't the expansion of federal power. It's something very, very different. It's a recognition exercise that's been going on for 12 years. It's disappointing what Dutton did, but I think there's a lot of good analysis about why he did what he did. He either had to go along with it and try and claw back some of those teal seats. He cannot win the next election. He has been voted out of every city and urban region, and he's decided to go the other way. And so what we've found in relation to that is that Australians are now just kind of voting along party lines. And so that's why you've seen the vote drop. And we'll see how that lands in the next month or so. But I think the one thing that's most disappointing about the bipartisanship is that Albanese came in last year. So a lot of the voice is influenced by the 8 years of Conservative government. And yeah. I was very disappointed when Littleproud said no before he'd even seen the detail. To me, that's one of the reasons for the voice, is that so many politicians in this space don't read anything. And so a lot of their policy making is off the back of bureaucrats in their ear who are pushing an agenda, elites in their ear pushing an agenda, or anecdote. Yeah, when they get in their jet and they fly around and they say, Auntie Mabel from this, community said this, and therefore, and that's what serves our community so poorly, is that so much policy is done by anecdote.
And we see that kind of, sorry to interrupt, but we see that kind of cherry picking going on now, don't we? Where someone will go to one member of a community, use that one member who says, I don't understand the voice or I don't support it. And that becomes rationale then for a politician to cite it, rather than the considered response of communities through a formal consultation process, arriving at a consensus position, which should be far more persuasive. But it involves actually reading something. And, you've made this point before. You make this point in the essay. Politicians historically, right through this, going way back, have just not taken the time to read, to actually read the detail, understand what they're doing.
And the ABC does that a lot. They'll send a reporter out, they'll interview one Aboriginal person, and then they'll contact all the campaigns saying, well, we got one a couple of days ago for Western Queensland, and they said, TOs are saying they don't support it. And we said, well, who are you talking to? And they said, we don't want to give you names. So they're just going out with microphones and they're running these stories regularly on social media. And, these Aboriginal people don't know. And I mean, it's the easiest kind of journalism in this space. I mean, I think one of the key things about Littleproud saying no, and then Dutton, but especially Littleproud, is that the Nationals held this portfolio for the bulk of that 8 years. And the Australian National Audit Office shows that red tape and bureaucracy increased under the LNP. I don't know why no journalist has ever said to them, what expertise, knowledge, or experience do you have that you think you are capable of assessing the voice? You call it bureaucratic, but your government increased the bureaucracy. You say there'll be too much red tape, you increase the red tape. None of this has been put to the opposition in relation to the campaign they're running, when actually they did an absolutely appalling job as government in this space. It seems to me like such a massive oversight for the mainstream media to not be scrutinising them on what they did during their time in office, because their kind of flagship policy, the Indigenous Advancement Strategy, which I write about in the essay, led to the voice. It's their policy.
And the voice, as you also say in that section, is actually a plea for less bureaucracy, for reducing bureaucracy, not for increasing it. So this argument that gets put forward that this is, will establish a whole new strata of Indigenous bureaucrats and people on the gravy train and so forth. This is a kind of a discourse that runs on the
100%.
right.
I mean, our people didn't come into Uluru and say, we want more bureaucrats in Canberra controlling our lives. That's not what they said. I said this to David Littleproud. They said the absolute opposite. They don't like bureaucrats. They don't like bureaucrats subjugating them and up in their face, telling them what they should and shouldn't do. That's what happens. Our people don't want to move to Canberra. They don't want to be politicians. It's why they didn't call for a voice in the parliament. It's why they didn't want designated or reserved seats. Our mob don't want to belong to professional political parties. They don't want to have to commit to party discipline and ideological positions. They live in communities because they want to represent their own people and live in their own homes where they grew up on country. They don't want to move to Canberra. Nothing could be further from the truth. But what they would like is the agency to be cut in half. There's half of your savings. The agency that executes so much power over our communities and exercises so much of the decision making that should be in the hands of mob on the ground. They don't want more bureaucracy. They don't want more Canberra in their face. They want to have a voice, and that's something that they're not getting. And that's partly why the system doesn't work, because it is bureaucrats in Canberra dictating. It is politicians who are governing by anecdote. That's why our people want a voice, because right now nobody incorporates their views into the laws and policies. And so we can see the failures. But Labor will have to step up and take responsibility for that at some point, but also the LNP. They've just presided over almost a decade of this area, but they're not being scrutinised on the fact that they created the problem that we have now. Yeah.
Well, speaking of anecdote, one of the anecdotes that you tell in the essay actually goes to this problem of the sort of the flood of bureaucrats and process, the inability to hear the message directly from the ground to government. I wonder if you could tell the story of the chap who thought it might be good to have some tomato seeds. Sorry, you're on mute, I think, Megan.
I'm making all the amateur errors here today. It's a story that Arnie Pat repeated at the National Press Club 20 years ago, which speaks to kind of how these things never change. But it is a famous story in the Northern Territory about an old man who was sitting on his veranda when some bureaucrats came past, had a yarn with him, something to do with maintenance, and he just said, "Oh yeah, I wouldn't mind a few tomato seeds to build, to grow a few tomatoes." And Pat tells this kind of eloquent story about the department sending out, scientists to test the soil, and people coming out to test, the weather and the water, and people coming out and measuring things, and something like 6 months later passes and nothing is actually changed, but there's just been this stream of government officials coming out to work out how to build a tomato patch. And he says to them at one point, all I wanted was a couple of seeds. But it's a perfect example, I think. I mean, I was just reading this morning the Productivity Commission in Queensland's report into remote communities, and the finding was that the bureaucracy kind of just exists for itself. And that a big part of the work of the bureaucracy in remote communities in Queensland is actually for their own optics. So to take photos of what they're doing, to say they're doing things. And then the third dot pointing is devastating. And I mean, most people would not have read this report. It's 400 pages long, but it says that the whole system exists to maintain Aboriginal welfare dependency because it's an industry. I mean, and that is what's going on in this country. The Productivity Commission at a national level has said this kind of $30 billion that's bandied around, probably about 27% hits communities. Well, the rest of it is a huge industry on which a lot of people are making a lot of money off disadvantage, and they don't want the status quo to change because they're literally going to lose businesses as a consequence of people getting control back over their lives. And that's the sad thing about what's going on. And I think we need more Australians to understand that it is an industry, but it's not an industry that Aboriginal people are benefiting from at all. And you can see that in the statistics.
One of the criticisms that is oft heard is this one about, dividing, as we referred to it before, this idea of this being merely a project of identity politics. But you contest that in the essay, and you cite Stan Grant Sr., who makes the point that it's not who you are, it's where you are. Can you speak to that? Yeah.
I mean, identity politics I always had problems with, right? Because I'm always cynical of theories that come out from universities, particularly in the humanities, where people posit theories about what's going on in any particular phase in human life. And identity politics is one of those. I don't know why people use it all the time. And then it just becomes
I think it's
empty.
a pejorative, isn't it? I mean,
It is definitely a pejorative. I'm not sure if it started out that way.
Right.
But that's kind of used less and less, I think, in the Australian context. I think it's lost its kind of usefulness. I think the word woke is what everybody uses now. But yeah, no, the Uluru Statement is very much about location. So the Uluru Statement is an invitation to the Australian people. The reason being that in the conversations we had at the dialogues and out at the Rock, the only way to get change in this country will have to be through the Australian people. We will need to convince them of the problem that exists, the structural problem. What is it? And that this is part of the solution to addressing that. So most Australians accept that the status quo is not working, and most accept that politicians are part of the problem. And we know after decades and decades, you cannot go to Canberra and convince them of anything. You cannot. It's impossible. It's impossible to get them to listen. So
you talk about a sort of a look that comes in their eyes. They don't listen because I think you quote, maybe it's just trying to remember who it might be. It's not Pat Anderson.
Malcolm Fraser, I think it was.
Yeah, well, the quote was, they don't listen because they don't have to.
Yeah.
Might have been Tom Calmer, I think, might have made that.
Well, Tom said leaders are readers, but I think it was Mr. Yunupingu who said they don't listen because they don't have to. And I mean, that is at the heart of the Uluru Statement. Part of the constitutional enshrinement is it's not enough to say, I'll just legislate. They will not listen unless they're asked to listen. It's a powerful thing to mandate that aspect of listening to what it is communities are saying. And that is part of the problem that we've had. And we say, and did say at the Rock, there's two elements to this. The whole recognition process was turned around, and the Referendum Council was set up by Turnbull, and Uluru happened because our people said recognition is not equivalent to acknowledgement. That is its dictionary meaning. And there are some LNP people still prosecuting this argument. I will accept the recognition part, but not the voice, which tells me they have not read anything after 2015. Yes. That's really problematic. They have not followed the debate at all. I'm sure it's actually just a ploy because they're trying to say, oh, recognition is actually acknowledgement. It's not a voice. A voice isn't recognition. No, what happened was we went to Abbott and we said to Tony Abbott, acknowledgement, the dictionary meaning is not what recognition is, and it's not what our people will accept as appropriate and meaningful recognition. We need a new process where we actually go out to people and ask them what is meaningful recognition. And I would say 98% of the Aboriginal people say no to symbolic recognition.
Yeah, so you talk about the difference between symbolic and substantive, don't you, in the essay? The idea it has to actually have some material outcome from it to mean something, because constitutions are where the business of nations are done, I think is the way you put it.
100%. And there's a unity ticket of Aussies and Aboriginal people on this. Australians also say, don't go to the trouble of a referendum if it's going to be tokenistic and not actually change anyone's lives on the ground, which is the key driving, issue with some of the soft yes now, is they want to know it'll make a difference. Australians want change in this space. And so a symbolic form of recognition that the LNP support, that's not going to do anything. Noel Pearson calls it a plaque in the Constitution. All it is a statement of fact that says we were once here, we are still here, and will be here forevermore. That's it. It doesn't actually empower anyone to do anything. It doesn't compel the state to do anything. And there's zero evidence across the world that symbolic recognition in constitutions change any of the material conditions of people's lives on the ground, whether it's non-Indigenous or Indigenous. So, recognition in the sense of constitutional recognition, and this has been the case since Gillard for 12 years, is that it sits on a spectrum. There's weak recognition and strong recognition. The weak end is forms of recognition that do nothing. They're, as Noel says, they're the flowery plaques in the Constitution, and they're called weak because they don't compel the government to do anything, they don't prohibit the government from doing anything, and it doesn't empower Indigenous people. At this end of the spectrum, the strong end of recognition, are mechanisms that you put into the Constitution that do prohibit governments from doing anything. For example, passing racist laws, or they compel governments to do something like setting up a voice, or they empower Indigenous peoples. So there's a spectrum of reforms, and it's not, you know, like the dialogues did in any country. You sit in a room and go, well, the political and legal temperament of this nation means you can't go all the way to that end of the strong spectrum, but the weekend's not going to get you anywhere. So you've got to find out, well, what is it that will be possible in terms of political imperative, because that's really important. That is it's all right to be in the streets as an activist saying, rah, rah, I want this. It's a different thing to go to Canberra and break bread with people that you don't normally talk with to get a substantive change like this. And so voice was what came out of the Uluru process. And partly, I think, because communities felt so invisible and voiceless and powerless in their own situation. It was heavily informed by the Abbott government Indigenous Advancement Strategy, which is still in place. That strategy decimated the sector, so much so that when we went out to do the dialogues, people were not happy and not in the mood to discuss recognition. They'd lost programs, policies, funding, jobs, all with a stroke of a pen, because the Commonwealth bureaucrats and the politicians didn't bother to check what they were scrapping. And they just scrapped the bulk of the sector and put it into one bucket, and then asked mob to apply for their money again. And the first round of money that the Australian National Audit Office found went to something like 70 to 80% of non-Indigenous organisations, many of which were funding their Reconciliation Action Plan initiatives. And a lot went to not-for-profits like Save the Children, who delivered programs that blackfellas used to deliver in their communities, like Yarrabah. They took over all of the Indigenous services. And that all happened under the last government. So voice is recognition. Recognition is voice. That is what our people are saying is meaningful recognition of us in the Constitution. But your point about location is really critical. This is about us coexisting on this continent together. When we talk about the Uluru Statement, when we talk about country, when we talk about our relationship with other Aussies, we're talking about location. And we need to find ways of living and working together. And right now, where we are situated in terms of the Australian polity, and our voice is not recognised in the Constitution, we are not recognised in that Constitution, then, you know, we're not even co-located as a peoples together. And the Uluru Statement is very much about bringing Australians together and saying, you live on our country, you're born on our country, you work every day across Aboriginal footprint, or you fly into our country and you know, you're a new Australian. This is your country, but you need to recognise us. You need to recognise who we are and our voice. And so the Uluru Statement is a unifying principle. It is intended to bring the Australian people together with First Nations people. And as we say, very earnestly, we want you to meet us at the Rock and walk with us in a journey of the Australian people for a better future. And that is what that statement is imbued with. And when we travel around the country right now, we're finding most Australians haven't read it, and they don't know that the Uluru Statement is an invitation to them. It is a hand of friendship, an olive branch after everything that has happened to our people. It is an expression of love to the Australian people. It's why it's the Uluru Statement from the heart. And that's the approach our old people took to try to convince Australians or persuade Australians of the exigency of reform. It comes from very much from the heart.
Yes, well put. I suppose going to what you were saying there, though, about in terms of the way Australians are looking at it, and sort of symbolic at one end and quite dramatic change at the other end, and finding that right place. That, in a sense, is the political task for the campaign: is to find that place where it actually achieves outcomes for First Nations peoples and is acceptable, embraced by the broader electorate. As you say, it sort of started out in a relatively strong position. To some extent, the narrative, at least to where we are now, and at least on the basis of the data that we have now, seems to have been written to a degree by opponents of it. And around that, I suppose, underneath all of that, and this goes to all referendums, is the question of risk. The risk that this will change the country in some way, the risk that there will be, according to the no narrative, a whole new bureaucracy, that there'll be division rather than unity, and so forth. These things are thrown around. I wonder if that risk, what you think about that sort of risk problem, and what it says about how little white Australia understands the risk associated with continued failure in this space over a long period of time. Linda Burney was talking yesterday, and she talked about First Nations peoples being 55 times more likely to be diagnosed with rheumatic heart disease, 24 times more likely to be locked up than the rest of Australia, 4 times more likely, young men anyway, 4 times more likely to go to jail than to graduate from a university. These are deep structural problems that go right back to the negation and the refusal to acknowledge the pre-existence of First Nations on this continent. And yet all of those failings, which are costing people money, I mean, that's, there's been, as you said before, billions wasted over the years on things. All of that is a risk, and yet it doesn't seem to enter into the debate that the no case is putting forward.
Yeah, it's very eloquently put. I mean, I think one of our problems is that yes, and doesn't sell. So the negative sells, and my partner's a journo. He's just finished with Newswire, and he's like, look, it's negative that drives the clickbait. But it is, and so it's very hard to get columns. It's very hard to get into the media. Which is why I think places like TikTok and other places will be useful for prosecuting this argument. But I think it's a really important one that you've raised, which is the downstream impact of no change upon our people and our communities is significant. The impact of no change means that the maintenance of this billions of dollars of money that exits taxpayer hands and goes into this industry that vultures just gorge off the carcass of what is this constructed framework of Aboriginal disadvantage. And I think a few things. I think that's happened because, one of the reasons the Uluru Statement was issued to the Australian people is we know what retail Australian politics are like for Aboriginal people. Retail Australian politics is no change. We had to do something dramatic to try and get the attention of the Australian people, because if it goes through a political lens, it ends up kind of where it is now. And of course, in terms of risk, Dutton's not going to assess really the risk of no change because he presided over the no change order, and he was quite happy with that. He was quite happy with that. They never made any substantive change in their policies, apart from closing the gap, which, if you read a lot of the really excellent work of his name, now it escapes me, I'll remember in a moment. If you read a lot of the really excellent analysis of what happened under the Morrison era, their kind of the devolving of their responsibility as a federal government to the states and territories, was kind of done. It was done in plain sight, but never really picked up. And so they commenced very early on the dismantling of closing the gap. They walked away on leadership and money. And with the new iteration of closing the gap, they walked away from their constitutional responsibility that the Australian people gave to them in 1967. And none of this is apparent to anyone in the Australian community because they're just not scrutinised. Their term of government, which has led to the problem, like really led to some of the accelerated problems we have, happened under their government. But I do worry about, one of the things, as a constitutional lawyer, you're thinking about structural change, but what's the structural impact of nobody ever listening to what you have to say? And that's what I've witnessed as a junior lawyer to whatever I am now, not too senior, I'd hope. Just the system, just never listening. It's extraordinary. And that's where I found a lot of really interesting writing, political writing, and legal writing, but mainly political writing on the failure to listen. What does that do to a people? Well, it actually has really severe impacts upon their health and well-being. And you do see that manifest in communities where, where people just don't get to have a say. And that's a real failure of our liberal democracy, that our people aren't listened to. And then the consequence of that is the suite of policy that we had for the past 8 years and have had for the past 2 years under the new government, that doesn't have communities who live in people who live in communities, looking after their communities, driving that policy and driving that change. They are actually the people who know better. Not someone like me in Sydney. I'm just a constitutional lawyer, but I can't say what's best for even my community in Logan. My brothers who live there can tell us. But there's a concept of ethical loneliness that I write about in the book that speaks to this idea that people remove themselves from the society in which they live when they're just continually ignored and let down by the people who are meant to protect them and are meant to help them. And I use child protection as one of those examples because that is a system that has abandoned its fundamental values, and has abandoned Aboriginal families and they put all their money at the child removal end of the kind of cycle. But when you look at our ill health and death rates, and you look at the huge suicide rates that I'm astonished we are not utterly shocked about in this country, especially youth suicide. The risk of no change is so acute. It is so acute. The risk. So if I can just say, the risk of bureaucracy it can't be higher than it was under the last government, and it would see a halving at least of the agency. And if the agency kind of outsourced its work back to the departments that are responsible for particular programs, you might even get rid of the agency. So bureaucracy is not my concern. It's a concern for the no case, because bureaucracy is a code word for Australians, and Australians think more money and more public servants, and we don't like public servants. The issue of the High Court has been completely overstated. I would say 95% of the legal profession agree on this. I think Brett Walker is right when he said that a lot of the scenarios that have been held up are just too silly for words.
Yeah.
And the one thing I would say is Australia is distinguished as a liberal democracy by its robust and independent courts, and its robust and independent judiciary. We are distinguished from other nations by our judiciary and our rule of law. So it may be that some people will challenge things in the High Court, or seek special leave, I should say, to go to the High Court.
Yeah, they may not even have those cases heard if they're regarded as vexatious.
They're likely not to, based on what we know about Section 129. But nobody complained about the COVID era, where there were tinfoil arguments put up to the High Court all the time about regulation of movement of Australians and vaccines and other things. So if you seek to just, allow those tinfoil opportunities to take advantage of our rule of law and robust legal system, then there may be people that try it on. Of course there will be. But that is what we have as a nation, a robust judicial system, and a rule of law that says people can do that.
And this would be the High Court that is set up under a power of the Constitution as well. I mean, people forget that is why placing the voice in the Constitution, but leaving the design of it, the structure of it, its powers and so forth up to the Parliament are two separate exercises, as indeed is the creation of the High Court of Australia.
Yeah, Mark, this is a really lost point, I think, in the debate, and that is, this is a constitutional referendum. So referendums are for the constitutional alteration, but the Constitution is for principle. And so what we're asking Australians to agree on, because we can't even get that voice set up unless Australians agree to this fundamental principle, that First Nations communities are entitled to give input or venture an opinion on the laws and policies that are made about their lives. That's the principle we want Australians to vote on. Now, if they say yes, then it opens the door and we all walk through to the other side where our elected parliamentarians supervise the creation of that body. And that will involve input from the community, our community, and input from the Australian community, and huge amounts of input from politicians. And we know that the ATSIC debates were actually, I think, second or third longest debates in Australian history for a piece of legislation. So we're asking Australians to commit to that principle. We can't have a fully fledged model prepared before we vote, because we don't want that model entrenched in the minds of people when they go to vote, because the model of 2023 might not suit the model of 2052. So Dutton was absolutely wrong yesterday in the news. The model can change, and he's the guy that is elected to help supervise if the model does need tinkering with. But he supervises, along with Albo, the design of that voice. The other thing that's important to keep in mind is that if Australians do commit to the principle that we are entitled to venture an opinion on what laws and policies look like, then they would also agree that our people have to have a phase where we say what the model looks like. That's a fundamental Westminster principle. Institutions rise and fall on the people who use them, having input into what they look like. They're more likely to succeed. And so we will have that phase as well on the other side of a referendum. But it's principle first, and then the detail that comes next. There is a huge amount of detail that has been released, and it's available for people who want to see what the parameters of the model is. But the bulk of it will be designed by Aboriginal people, Torres Strait Islander people, Australians giving input, and again, Australians having input through their representatives on the other side. It's not like any other institution that is set up. In 1901, we recognised the High Court of Australia in our Constitution. It wasn't set up in legislation. The detail wasn't set up until several years later. And there's multiple institutions like that in our Constitution. So it's a special kind of vote. It's not a normal vote. And elements of detail are often always deferred right across the world when it comes to constitutional amendment.
Yeah, I mean, it's just not the place to fix that level of detail in the Constitution, because that in itself becomes unrepresentative or potentially undemocratic down the track if, as you say, circumstances change and improvements or other modifications are deemed necessary, then it's open to parliaments to do so. What the constitutional enshrinement does, though, is establish that there will be such a body. There's been an awful lot of misrepresentation about that. I would imagine, I'd imagine you'd agree with this, that in the aftermath of a successful referendum, the Parliament would need to and would probably be inclined to constructively address this. It will have just had a vote of the Australian people. There is no more, for the double hurdles that exist, the double majority and so forth. There is no more direct formal mechanism for gauging the views of Australians than the referendum. And if that has happened, then presumably the Parliament would, responsive to that process, conscientiously go about creating a body that has that degree of robustness and that reflects the will of the Australian people. Yeah,
if the Australian people say yes, that is their next job. And I mean, I think the agency of the Australian people is so critical here. And that issue that I mentioned before, they need to be forced to listen. Legislation doesn't rise to the threshold of being forced to listen. Things are so bad, they do not take into account any Indigenous. They do on some matters, but only probably by people who lead community control organisations or big Indigenous, NGOs and not-for-profits. People who have those passes that get into Parliament House where you lobby for money, etc. It's not. They are in and around the policy space. But what we heard in the Uluru dialogues was a real tension between those groups and grassroots communities, because the community said none of those Aboriginal organisations represent our voice. None of them. They don't come back to us and tell us what they're doing in our name or with our money. So we want a new voice. We want to be the voice. And then the Wyatt process under Morrison, that terms of reference said that the voice could only be entities that already exist. So you can see the real tension there between communities out on the ground and the structure that already exists. That structure is really important. But as for now, we can see that community voices aren't really included in those decisions. And we can see the gap widening in some areas and minuscule changes in others. And so that voice is really critical. But to have those people at the table, we need Australians to say, we want them at the table. We want Arnie Mabel at the table. That's who we want at the table. We don't want Megan Davis. We want Arnie Mabel at the table. That rhymed too, by the way.
I noticed.
That is what we need Australians to say, because unless Australians say it, they do not listen and they won't listen.
Yeah. Look, we're right out of time. I'm going to ask you a question. I suppose it wraps in a notion that you bring up in the essay about the need to have imagination here, to imagine the possibility of change. I want to draw it back to the image of you as a 12-year-old Megan Davis carrying around a constitution, a copy of the Constitution, and being fascinated by it. Does that child's love for the Constitution or fascination with it, does it survive a no vote?
I never think about no votes. One of the reasons that we and Arnie, Pat and our team have survived is every no we've just pretended is a yes. And it turns out there's philosophers who talk about this kind of thing, that, moving through the world, sometimes you just have to pretend. So when Malcolm Turnbull said no, we just ignored him. When Morrison said no, we just ignored him. And we just kept moving on. But a big part of that 6 years of ignoring him was Australians. Like, I remember hearing secondhand that a big number of women from the North Shore just inundated the Prime Minister and those electorates with deep anger that they just dismissed the Uluru Statement and this amazing offer to the Australian people. Being able to do that, no, we've been able to do that with a lot of Aussies walking behind us or with us. And so, law reform is about imagination. So, right to the end, you have to believe, because that's how the Constitution was set up. The guys that drafted it, they knew it had to change at different points, and they set it up in a rigid way. So politicians weren't the main ones to change it, and a lot of constitutions around the world, it's politicians who change it, not our country. It's the people. And so you've got to believe that the system was set up to change. It can change, and you've got to believe it can. And I think that's where our people's heads are. We still very much have faith in the Australian people to wade through this period of misinformation and disinformation, of lots of politicians trying to kill the reform because they think it might benefit their next re-election efforts. But I never think about no. And I liked Linda's answer at the press club yesterday. We never think that it's going to be a no.
Well, on that very hopeful note, we're going to have to close now. But look, congratulations on this essay. It's a sterling piece of work. It's well worth reading for everyone. I heartily recommend it to all people watching today. And indeed, it comes at the in the middle of a vast amount of work that you and your colleagues have done on this campaign, and there's much work to go. So Megan Davis, thanks so much for being with us here on this webinar. It's been a real privilege. Mark. And that's it from the Australia Institute. I'm Kenny from the Australian Studies Institute, if that's not confusing, at ANU. This will be available later on YouTube, I'm told. So if you want to recommend it to anyone, then do so. There's much information there. Bye for now. I assume I end.